And then we will get started. Right. Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, Finding Hope in the Face of Climate Change, with Susan B. Inches, author of the newly released book, Advocating for the Environment, How to Gather Your Power and Take Action. I'm Brenda Harrington, Program Librarian at the Belfast Free Library, and I want to thank you all for joining us. Before we get to tonight's presentation, I would like to mention that this program is part of the All of Belfast Climate Dialogues, or ABCD, a project of the Belfast Free Library, which we created to help all residents in our area talk about climate change and its impacts in order to increase awareness and help us all prepare for the challenges ahead. As part of the ABCD project, and because we cannot meet in person, we are seeding conversations by building a collection of climate change stories and observations on our website. I invite you to go to our website, belfastlibrary.org, and follow the link to all of Belfast Climate Dialogues to learn how to participate. In the month of December, we have an incentive for you. If you share a climate change observation, concern, or hope with us through our website, you will be entered in a drawing to win a copy of Sue Inch's book. The deadline to submit is December 21st. And now to introduce our speaker. Prior to writing Advocating for the Environment, Sue Inches worked in public policy for over 25 years, serving as the Deputy Director of the State Planning Office. She also worked with the fishing, aquaculture, and seafood processing industries as a director at the Department of Marine Resources and chaired the board of Coastal Enterprises. Sue now works as an author, consultant, teacher, and advocate with a focus on the environment and climate change. Her new book is filled with advice and insight as to what we as ordinary citizens can do to tackle climate change through advocacy and policy-based solutions, which all begins with our personal stories and how talking with each other about climate change can lead to successful collaborations to enact change. I want to remind you all that during the program, please keep your mic muted and put questions in the chat. After the presentation, I will be joined by my colleague from the ABCD project, Sarah Kern, who will lead the Q&A and discussion. With that all said, I now welcome and invite Sue Inches to take the mic. Thank you, Sue.
Hey, thank you, Brenda. And it's great to see so many people here. This is awesome. I'm coming to you from North Yarmouth, Maine, and it's great to be with you here tonight. And I'm looking forward to sharing about maybe a half an hour of slides and ideas with you. And then we'll have a dialogue and answer your questions and talk about these issues. So let me start by sharing my screen, and we will just see, let's see, there it is. Okay, you should be seeing my screen now, hopefully. Everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great.
Yes.
So finding hope in the face of climate change. I first want to just say that I've written this book, Advocating for the Environment, because there's so much out there about the gloom and doom and everything that's wrong and all the problems we have. And I didn't see much of anything out there on what ordinary people can do about it. And the fact is that when you take action, you start to feel better. This is the therapy we all need, is to actually take some action, make a difference, and move things forward in the right direction. So I wrote this book as a citizen's guide to advocacy because there was nothing like it on the market. So advocacy, as Brenda kind of indicated, all starts with your personal Earth connection stories. And I know when I'm talking to a main audience like you, we all have these stories. We all have places that we like to go out in nature that regenerate us, that allow us to relax and reconnect with ourselves and with the earth and with each other. And we all have stories and we all have experiences of things that have happened to us on the earth. Things like when I went on vacation last summer, I went to a very remote public place called Dubuli, And honestly, the way the Milky Way looked there at night, I mean, there was just a completely black sky with this silver arch going across. It was just so inspiring, and it really took me to a different place. That's an Earth connection story. Another story I have that sometimes I share is that when I was in college, I went out west for a year to plant trees on forest lands. And when I went out there to plant trees, what I saw was that the logging companies had clear cut the forests, and then they had burned the forest, and then they had sprayed Agent Orange. They'd sprayed toxic chemicals, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, to kill all the vegetation. And then as a result of this clear cutting and burning and chemical treatment, basically there was nothing to hold the soil. And we were planting trees on the steep mountains of the Cascades along the western coast of Oregon. All the soil was just flowing down the sides of the mountains into the river and out to sea. And I saw this and I thought, if this is how we're logging, things need to change. And there was a story, an Earth connection story for me that was extremely motivating. And I ended up coming back to Maine after that year on the West Coast and becoming an environmental advocate. I actually enrolled at College of the Atlantic when I came back and studied environmental issues. So I know that everybody here has their own Earth stories. And I mention that because that's the basis. That's where advocacy actually starts, is with our own personal stories. And what they do for us is they ground us in our deepest truth. And they keep us motivated when the going gets tough, which sometimes it does in advocacy work. And you've got to remind yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I beating my head against the wall here? Well, these stories keep us on track. And sometimes our Earth stories do relate directly to a policy issue, not always, but sometimes. And then, of course, our Earth connection is really going to be the basis of our future. If we want to create a sustainable planet, these are the basis of our future. And the power of our stories really in advocacy work is that they create a human connection with the decision makers. So every politician, every corporate leader is basically a human being, and you need to try to connect to the heart of that person. And our own personal Earth stories, they do that. They create that platform. And one example that I like to give here is about fracking in Pennsylvania. Because in Pennsylvania, the oil and gas lobby had convinced the legislature that fracking was not harmful to the environment. It takes place deep underground. Don't worry about it. Nobody's going to be affected by it. It wasn't until the citizens came forward and said, my well is poisoned. My animals are dying. There's something really wrong here. And the decision makers needed to hear that. They needed to hear the on-the-ground experience of real people to understand that the truth is fracking is very harmful to the environment. And what they're being told by the lobbyists was basically not true. So this is the role of citizens in advocacy, and the role of the stories is to bring that human experience into the issues. So there are really two ways that stories are used in advocacy. And one, of course, as I just mentioned, is to internally ground and center you. And the other is to show how ordinary people are affected by public policies. Now, some of you might have heard of Fred Stone. He is a farmer who lives in York County. His family had been farming on the same property for over 300 years. He had a dairy herd that had been carefully bred over that long period of time to be the highest quality milk, producing herd. Unfortunately, he had been spreading municipal sewage sludge on his field as fertilizer for many years. And very unfortunately, it was found later that that sludge contained toxic chemicals, a group of chemicals called PFAS. And he found that out, and it turned out that his herd had been eating the grass and drinking the water, and his milk was contaminated. And he lost his entire business. Even he and his family members had high levels of PFAS detected in their blood. So what did Fred do about that? Well, he was very courageous, and he took his story to a state legislative committee, the Natural Resources Committee of the Maine State Legislature, and he told his story. And his doing that actually started a movement. Maine is now the leader in the country for banning and cleaning up these PFAS chemicals. And it all started with Fred telling his story. So sometimes it's really important for ordinary people to get in front of the decision makers and share what has happened to them. So the other thing, as you can see in this story, is that citizen voices are so important, so important. I mean, we wish, that our political leaders and our corporate leaders would basically do the right thing for the environment. But the unfortunate truth is they're not going to stick their neck out unless they know they have support behind them. So they need citizen support behind them so they can do the right thing. And the other unfortunate thing that happens all too often is that if citizens don't speak up, we get corporate policy. There are all these highly paid lobbyists who are there talking to decision makers every day. And if citizen voices aren't there, that's what we get. We get corporate policy. And without citizen voices, environmental injustices just grow. So what I'm saying here is that decision makers really need you. Without your stories and experience, decision makers won't know the impact of their decisions. And your job as a citizen advocate is to take an abstract concept and make it real. For these laws are often very abstract, and I'll talk a little bit later about constitutional rights. Very abstract. What decision makers need to know is, how do these things affect you and your family and your property? And then finally, of course, your perspective as a citizen, especially if it's helped solve a problem, is actually a gift that you're bringing to decision makers. And this is so especially true in Maine because our legislators, our town council and select people, our city councils, they're all volunteers. And so basically you can help them do their job by bringing them your perspective and solutions to problems. So people are much more powerful than they think they are. They need to speak up at all levels. And one of the things I love to ask live audiences, it's a little harder here on Zoom, but is how many phone calls does it take to move a decision maker? And in Maine, you might want to guess, you might think it would be like 50 or 25. It's actually 5, just 5. I've talked to many different legislators about this, and this is what they'll tell you. If I get 5 phone calls or 5 emails about an issue, that's enough to get my attention. And the key to it is you don't have to be an expert. Just have to say that you care and why. You have to say something like, well, my daughter has asthma and the air pollution is really harming her health. They need to hear that. It's like you don't have to be an expert with facts and figures. You just have to have your experience and tell that experience to the people making decisions. So I'm going to diverge for a second here and talk a little bit about the environmental movement and the history of it. And a very key point in environmental history was the year 1969. In that year, there was a devastating oil spill off of Santa Barbara, California. Maybe some of you remember this. 3 million gallons of crude oil were spilled, and they had pictures on TV of the sea ducts. You'll see a picture of it here covered with oil. That same year, the Cuyahoga River, which is, it's right near Cleveland, Ohio. It had caught fire actually many times, but that fire was caught for the first time on television. And that had a huge impact on people, as did pictures of smog over Los Angeles, where you couldn't see the mountains that surround that city. And really, it was all because these images appeared on television, and that for the first time we had nightly news on television, and families would all sit together and watch the news. So these images had a really strong impact on this country. And in fact, they led to the very first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. And the thing that's really key to know about this is that 20 million Americans participated and turned out for events on that first Earth Day. 20 million Americans. That was 10% of the population, or almost 10% of the population at the time, which was 210 million people in this country. That was a huge number of people. That was critical mass, actually. And what resulted was 28 major environmental laws that were passed between 1970 and 1980. All of the laws that form the environmental legal framework today were initiated back in this decade of environmental lawmaking. And you can see on this slide, many of these are familiar to you. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the starting of the EPA, the Endangered Species Act. All of these things were created during that 10-year period because we had critical mass. We had people who were concerned enough about the environment to create this change. So here's the thing, is The most recent large environmental action was the climate strikes of 2019. And probably some of you participated in that, or you certainly were aware of that. Well, how many people participated in that? Well, if you look at it, only 4 million Americans participated that day as compared to 20 million on the first Earth Day. And so that represented only 1.8% of the current population of 328 million people. So we didn't quite make the same critical mass in the climate strikes that we did in 1970. And at the same time, some of the threats to our environment have actually grown. So the Santa Barbara oil spill, which was the biggest oil spill ever in 1969, only spilled 3 million gallons. The Deepwater Horizon, when that blew up in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, spilled 134 million gallons, a whole scale of difference between these things. And you can see on this slide, many other things have increased in severity, the hurricanes, the wildfires, and the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we've had less people showing up and sort of worse environmental threats going on. So the question is, can we create critical mass like we did in 1970? And my answer to that question would be yes. And in fact, there are many, many groups at all levels. There's so many neighborhood groups and local town groups. There's so many people working on this that I think actually we're probably pretty close to critical mass at this time. But we need to pull ourselves together, and we need to do several things, which I'm going to talk about. So what we need to do is create power, and I'll talk about how we do that. We need to challenge the status quo. We need to envision the future that we want, and then we need to support that vision in everything we do. So one of my favorite quotes is this one. It says, "Power is infinite." And Eric Liu, who is the one who says this, he was an advisor to President Obama. He wrote a great book, which is pictured here. It's called "You're More Powerful Than You Think." And what does he mean by power is infinite? What is he talking about? Well, what he's talking about here is organizing. And in fact, citizen power really comes from two places. It comes from your personal power, your personal stories, and we've been talking about how important those are. So it comes from that deep spiritual place, that deep place of commitment within individuals. But citizen power also comes from organizing. When people get together and take action as a group, that is extremely powerful, and it creates power where none existed before. And a really wonderful and encouraging example of that right now is a place called Cancer Alley, which is basically a strip of the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It's like 150 miles, I think. And along that corridor, there's over 150 chemical and petrochemical and chemical plants. And unfortunately, that's a very highly polluted area. The rates of cancer and COVID are the highest in the country there. And the reason they're there is because of the river, of course, and transportation, but also because the companies, felt that we can locate there and nobody's going to say anything. Well, the really good news is that the people who live there are organizing. They have been organizing, and now it is very difficult to site any kind of chemical plant there. Whereas before it was pretty easy and they could just come in and say, we're going to create a lot of jobs, and people would say, okay, fine. Now that's not happening. And that's because the people living there have organized, and they're creating power, and they're keeping the corporate developers who want to put more chemical plants there out. So this is the power of the people, of organizing. It's really this is how change actually can happen, is through organizing of ordinary citizens. The people organizing in Cancer Alley are regular people. They come from low-income neighborhoods. There are many people of color living there, and they are saying enough is enough and getting organized. So successful organizers challenge the status quo. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, one of my favorite examples is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, because back when I was growing up, we considered drunks to be kind of funny and entertaining. In fact, there were skits on television of drunk people clowning around, and we thought that was really funny. And then, when a drunk driver would either injure or kill someone, we would sort of wring our hands and say, wow, what a tragedy. And we would send our thoughts and prayers, right? I mean, we just thought that was the way the world is, and we couldn't do anything about it. Well, Mothers Against Drunk Driving challenged that status quo, and they said, drunk driving is a crime. Drunk driving is a crime, and people should be held accountable for that. And so they organized really effective campaigns. They challenged the status quo. And now, basically, we see drunk drivers as criminals. They have to give up their license. They have to pay a fine. If we go out at nighttime and we're drinking, we designate a driver who has not been drinking to bring us home. So Mothers Against Driving is a great success story of challenging the status quo and organizing in support of it. Rivers is another great environmental example. Before we did anything about it, rivers were the sort of the drain pipe for our industries, and they stunk, and nobody wanted to live anywhere near them. And that was just kind of the smell of progress, it was called. And we thought that was the way it was. And it wasn't until that was questioned, seriously questioned. It was after the Cuyahoga and other rivers were catching on fire because they're so polluted, that things began to change, and the Clean Water Act was passed. And you can see on this slide some pictures of before and after, but we really have turned things around. And now riverfront property in a town is considered a community asset, and people are building walking trails and parks alongside their rivers. So another great success story. And then a couple of slides. This is a really fun, kind of a fun slide. I don't know if anybody knows where this is. It's a familiar place. This is actually the road to Popham Beach in the early, it's like 1962. And back in those days, to see, junk cars and other junk along the side of the road was pretty common, pretty normal. And here's another picture. This is also in Maine. I don't know exactly where it is, but it shows you kind of what we found acceptable until we questioned the status quo and got organized and said, wait a second, we need to clean up our act here, which we did, which we have successfully done. You don't see this so much anymore. So one of the things that I've realized as I studied social change over many years is that social change always starts with a moral question. Is it right to allow intoxicated people to drive? Mothers Against Drunk Driving questioned that. Is it right to leave the climate crisis for the next generation to solve? I was really excited in 2018 when Greta Thunberg and other young activists finally asked this question. I thought to myself, they're asking the right question, and this is going to be the pivot point where change begins to happen. So these are the questions that we have to ask in order to imagine a different future and in order for change to happen. And there are quite a few areas where we need to ask the moral question, where we need to do more work. And I would say that burning fossil fuels is one of these. We're still, the federal government is still allowing and auctioning off leases to drill and explore for oil and gas on public lands. Well, if we question, is it right to burn fossil fuels in 2021, we wouldn't be allowing that. We would be outlawing that. So we've got a little ways to go there. Similarly with corporate accountability, the typical scenario is that corporations make what they make a profit, and then the taxpayers clean up the mess later. And this is especially true in the chemical industry, where over 2,000 new toxic chemicals are introduced every year with very little oversight. And then if it turns out that some of those are causing damage, like PFAS, for example, then usually it's public money that cleans it up. It's our taxpayer dollars. So I think we got to question that. I think corporations ought to be held accountable for any kind of waste or damage that they cause. But we haven't really asked that question. We've kind of been all about business is good and profits are good, and we don't want to, hold back, making new jobs. Well, I think it's time to question that. Same thing with consumption and waste. We all know that packaging has actually increased greatly. I mean, everything's coming in these plastic, boxes, and we need to ask some questions about our consumption and our treatment of waste. And then also, I like to mention, women and family planning, because when I was doing research for the book, one of the startling facts to me was that 174 million women around the world would like to have access to family planning, but they don't have that. So this is not about forcing anybody to change anything. It's about saying people ought to have a choice about that. Women ought to be able to choose the number of children that they want to have. And that too takes, challenging the status quo. Why are we allowing this to happen? So these are just some areas. There are others, but these are just some areas that I think in particular, we need to challenge the status quo and organize in order to change. So now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about advocacy, because there's so many ways to advocate. You can advocate through art, you can advocate through teaching, any number of, there's many ways to advocate as there are people. And so I just kind of want to open that up to you. And I also want to talk about the difference between advocacy and direct action, because sometimes people aren't really clear about this. So advocacy is about building relationships with decision makers. So this is all about building trust, negotiating. It's getting to know your town council person, or getting to know your legislative representative, or maybe even your congressperson, or maybe even a corporate leader, but it's about building relationships. Direct action, in contrast, is about speaking out publicly about an issue. Now, there are times when we really need to speak out publicly. In fact, I think that in the last couple of years, the Black Lives Matter movement did an extraordinary job of speaking out publicly about an issue that really needed some attention. So it wasn't about working with decision makers, it was about making a statement and getting the media to help them make that statement. And so both of these things are really important, and they both work together. I mean, you need both of these things for social change, but people often don't understand the difference. And also, I always say that different people are attracted to and have the better skills for one or the other of these things. So, for example, I have a great friend and mentor, a fellow named George Lakey, and he's a direct action guy. He loves to go out and demonstrate. He actually likes getting arrested. I talked to him, back in September. He had just finished a walk for grandparents for climate change, grandparents who want to address climate change. And I said, well, how'd it go? And he said, I got arrested for the 22nd time. And he was really excited about that. Well, for me, that's not my thing. I would probably not want to get arrested. I would probably find that a little bit too over the edge for me. But I love to build relationships with decision makers and try to get them to see a different point of view. So it takes different kinds of people to do different parts of social change. And just to take this a little bit further, this picture here is my friend Andy Burt. And what she's been working on is organizing artists to create handmade lawn signs. This is a lawn sign for the Pine Tree Amendment, which I'll explain in just a second. But the whole point I'm making here is that you can advocate within whatever it is you already do. So I say that, if you are a landscaper, you can advocate for the earth by advising your clients not to use toxics on your lawn. If you are a chef or a cook, you can use local or organic ingredients, and you can explain why that's important to people. So even if you don't have time to advocate, which a lot of people say that, I don't have time to go to the legislature and testify, and not everybody does, but you can advocate from where you right where you are. That's the point. And it's also the point that in order to address things as big as climate change, everybody's got to figure out a way to advocate for the earth. We all have to be in this, because that's how big a shift we need to make. So I kind of urge you to think about what you do every day and how can you advocate for the earth within that. So once again, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk for a minute about something called the Pine Tree Amendment. I'm on the steering committee for this. What it is it's a campaign to add the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment to Maine's Constitution. And it's a pretty big systemic level change. It's pretty exciting. It's going to come up for a vote in the Maine legislature in January or February. So we're right kind of on that edge of getting it passed or not. And so let me talk a little bit about it. So 3 states have these rights in their constitutions: Montana, Pennsylvania, and New York actually just passed it in a referendum on election day in November. So it's new there. 13 states are working on this. And there's great information at thegreenamendment.org. This is our website. And there's a book too, as you can see here. It's a national movement, but we have a main group that is working on it. So why would we want this? This is interesting. So there are a couple really interesting, couple of important reasons. For one thing, people sometimes assume they already have the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment, but we actually don't legally. We do not have that right. And so those things can be threatened by people who want to either privatize or take things over for themselves. So if we had this right in our Constitution, what would it do? Well, it would proactively guide our environmental laws and policies. So every law and policy would have to take into consideration the fact that, Maine people have environmental rights. Another important aspect of this is it would make these rights permanent. So I worked in the legislature for a lot of years as a lobbyist, and I can tell you that we spent a lot of time passing laws that would later get overturned by the next administration. This happened in particular when we went from the Baldacci years to the LePage years. All kinds of laws that people had worked really hard to put in place were either completely overturned or maybe just never enforced at all. And so we need these constitutional rights to keep our environmental right together, to keep our environment clean, regardless of what the politics are of the day. And then finally, these constitutional rights give citizens a tool to challenge harmful environmental actions. And the picture on this slide actually is the tank farm in South Portland. And my guess is that if we had these environmental rights, it would have been a quicker and easier pathway to clean up the emissions, which if you don't know about this, basically these tanks in South Portland have been emitting toxic levels of chemicals for years without anybody really knowing about it. And having citizen rights to challenge something like that is really an important tool that we really want to add to our Maine Constitution. So I'm going to go back. So I'm telling you about this in part because we'd love to have support from people in this audience. We'd love to have people contact their legislators and say, please support this when it comes up for a vote. That's a simple action. You can write a note or send an email, do something really simple and just say, please support the Pine Tree Amendment. And we can talk in the Q&A about other ways to be supportive. Some towns are actually passing resolutions that basically say that environmental rights are part of their town, basically town resolutions. There are letters from different sectors, from fishermen, from artists, from restaurateurs, from breweries, saying we support the Pine Tree Amendment. So you can sign on to one of those letters. Lots of ways you can help us out. And I bring it up just because we're right at the edge of being able to pass this. And it has to pass by 2/3 in the House and Senate in Maine. And then it goes to a citizen referendum in the fall of 2022 if it passes. So this one's something I happen to be working on right now, and we're getting there. We're very close. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about vision, because if we don't focus on what we want, we'll never get there. And as you know, I don't have to tell anyone here that our media likes to focus on all the problems we have. We just get bombarded with information about problems, and more problems. And the problem with that is, the problem with the problem focus is that if we only focus on problems, we'll never actually get where we're going or where we want to go. We have to have some imagination and some vision of what we're trying to create together. And I believe we're trying to create a sustainable planet for our future generations. In short, my vision is said right here. My vision is that all life is respected, revered, and nurtured. And I just think this is really important. And in my book, I have this vision, and I've written up, what do I mean by all life is respected, revered, and nurtured? And I will read you part of this just so you can get a sense of it. So all life on earth is respected, revered, and nurtured. No race, class, gender, or any group of people is judged to be better or worse than any other. All people have access to fresh water, nutritious food, and safe housing. The Earth's natural ecosystems are thriving. Farming, forestry, and fishing both harvest and replenish the Earth's bounty. Every child has a healthy, loving, and safe home. All people have access to affordable, high-quality healthcare. All people have an opportunity to learn in a wide variety of high-quality educational settings. All people have an opportunity to succeed in expressing their unique gifts in the world. Every woman can choose the number of children she has. Governments set reasonable rules based on what the majority wants, and enforcement of those rules emphasizes helping violators to find a better path rather than punishing them. The world economy serves people equitably. It's based on providing goods and services people need and is not dominated by fear, lack, or greed. The world's unique peoples and cultures respect each other's differences and live in peace. So that's my vision, and you can certainly add to it or make it your own, but we need to have a sense of where is it we're trying to go. And this is what I'm working towards. This is where I'm trying to go. And I hope that you will join me in that. And really, we're at a pivot point in time right now. And the pivot point is, are we going to create a world that is compassionate, nurturing, and healthy for all of life, like this vision? Or are we going to continue business as usual? This is the choice that we're making right now today. And the other thing that I want to say about this is that the current disruptions, which there's so many, I mean, we have polarized politics, we have all kinds of things going on. They might be our best opportunity in years to make change. In fact, if you look at history, if you look back at the first Earth Day in 1970, that came about because of all the disruptions. That period of time, there was racial strife, there was environmental damage, there was all kinds of things going on. And out of that came, at least on the environmental side, all of those environmental laws, which have been so helpful to us. So I think what I say here is that in a way, we're at one of those pivot points where things are quite chaotic, but out of this, we could do better. And it gives us the chance, it gives us the opening to say, let's create a better world together. So I look at this as opportunity. And with that, I'm going to welcome your questions. I will say that my book is available. In fact, in Belfast, I know they have it at the Green Store. Of course, they have it at the library where the host of this program, and they also have it at Left Bank Books. So I hope you'll pick up a copy. There's lots more in there than I'm able to talk about. And with that, I would love to answer your questions. And also you can see here the Pine Tree Amendment website if you'd like to read up more about that. So let me, I'm going to stop sharing the screen here so that we can have more conversation.
That was wonderful, Sue. Thank you so much for that really inspiring and engaging talk, and very practical. And while folks in our audience get their questions together, I'll throw one out there. I hear you talking about relationships and that importance of having relationships with people. And one of the things about talking with people, it's always easier, especially in the climate world, we get used to talking to people who already agree with us. Mm-hmm. And it's so much more comfortable and it's safer. And there's real value in that, and feeling not alone when you're facing something as challenging. But we also aren't going to create change unless we're having conversations with people who don't necessarily agree with us. Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice or comments to make about how do you even, especially in the times of COVID, when we don't even talk to each other as much as we once did, how do we find those people who maybe don't agree with us and engage in a productive conversation?
That is such a great question. And there's a lot in my book about this, actually. But the first thing I would say is that the way to connect with people who might disagree with you is through lived experience. So for example, there was research actually done on this in Maine where people are noticing things about the climate that are different. For example, they're noticing that the ice melts on the lakes 2 weeks earlier than it used to. And so those are the things to connect with people on. Gee, have you noticed that it's the ice is melting sooner? The shrimp season, we haven't had a fishing season for shrimp now in like 4 years. That's because the water's too warm and the shrimp are going north. But you can talk about the actual experiences people have here in Maine, and that's a bridge to talk about climate issues, with people. So that's certainly one of the ways. Another thing that I do tell groups too is that we don't have to have everyone agree with us. We only need critical mass. And so there's questions around what critical mass really is, but social scientists have said anywhere from 3.5% to 10% is critical mass. And so, there are going to be some people who will never, ever agree with us, and that's kind of okay. In fact, what environmental advocates like to do is they like to map people as people that are on either extreme, and then they're the people in the middle. And it's the people in the middle that are persuadable. And those are the people that you want to reach out to and talk to, are the ones who, gosh, I've never really thought about it that much, or I've never seen it that way. They're willing to entertain a different idea. Those are the people that are really worth talking to. Some people, are just not going to change, although it's still worth talking about their experiences and asking them, so why do you think the ice is melting earlier? What do you think is causing that? It's you can sort of get into that. So, and the other thing too is, and I talk about this in the book, and it kind of goes deeper, and that is, there are certain worldviews and values that there are places where they kind of cross over. For example, I like talking about corporate accountability this way, because even really conservative people believe in individual accountability, that people should be held accountable for their actions, for any damage they cause, for a crime they might have committed. So that's a really good point to kind of get into a discussion about, well, that's interesting. So do you think corporations should be held accountable for maybe damage they create? So it kind of at the values level, there's sometimes some places where you can sort of start to ask these questions and be thoughtful about it and say, well, that's really interesting. Maybe we should be thinking more about that. And there's been some really interesting research, social science research, on what are some of the commonly held values on which you can base these conversations. Accountability is one area. Most people actually do believe that everything is connected. And so you can talk about connection. That's another place where you can find common ground. So there actually are areas where you can find common ground.
Great. And if people are interested in some of those resources that Sue just talked about, or some of those studies, they're actually linked off the All Belfast Climate Dialogues webpage. Brenda, maybe you drop a link into that. The Yale Climate Study, looking at the different kinds of Americans that are out there and the beliefs, and that work is summarized on that webpage, and there's a link to it. Or you can, of course, get Sue's book. So Peter, I see you in video. Does that mean you have a question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for a really inspiring talk. But I wanted to go back to something you said at the beginning of the talk, which is how important it is to contact your local representatives, and that it really only takes a few people for them to change their, let's say, their vote. But about a year ago, the study came out by Gillens and Page, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where they looked at 20 years worth of data from opinion polls, and then they compared that to how people in Congress actually voted, and they found out that basically public opinion doesn't really matter. And of course, you talked about a lot of other things we can do in order to make a critical mass, and of course, social changes happen just because of that. But I just, as a member of Citizens Climate Lobby, which really emphasizes the importance of contacting our representatives, to get policies changed, I just wonder if you could talk about that issue.
About Citizens Climate Lobby, or just
about public influence on their representatives, whether it really does make a difference if you write your elected representative, for example, probably at a national level more than a state level.
Yeah, I think it's harder at the congressional level, because we don't have, or not many of us have, the kind of personal relationships there that we have here. So that's what's so hard about it. In fact, I sort of tell people, if your sister is working in Susan Collins' office, then by all means pursue that relationship. But not all of us have those kind of personal relationships. So it makes it a lot harder to get through. But having said that, I still think that personal stories that are communicated really well. In fact, writing up the story, like basically, a handwritten or personal type note is so much more powerful than a mass email that 320 other people signed. Just, to think about your strategy of how are you going to get through to them. And I'll tell you a little anecdote about this that I really like. And that is, I teach at Colby College part-time. And so last year for the Pine Tree Amendment, one of the representatives from Waterville was saying, why should I care about this Pine Tree Amendment? I haven't heard from anybody about it. So I went to my class and I said, I need your help here. And so the students, about 5 or 6 of my students, wrote little handwritten notes, and they went downtown to Waterville and they put the notes through the slot in the front door of this representative's house. And I just thought that was a brilliant move, because it was the middle of the session. He's getting hundreds of emails every day. He probably never would have even opened an email from them because he didn't know them. But these handwritten notes on, put through the slot on his front door, I guarantee you he had to have seen those. And so, it's like trying to be a little bit strategic too about how you're going to get through to people. Obviously, a personal relationship is the best way, but you don't always know someone. These Colby students didn't know the representative personally, so they had to figure out, like, what's a creative way that we can get our message across that we really care about this issue, and that's what they did. So same thing kind of applies. I think Congress is much more difficult. I have colleagues in the fisheries industry who worked for 30 years to get community fisheries quota out of the federal government, and the patience they had, 30 years of work to get that to happen. That was pretty admirable. It's much easier to work on an issue here in Maine, where sort of the average turnaround time is more like 3 years, right? So it's really tough. Citizens Climate Lobby has been working really hard to get it's basically a carbon, they call it a carbon fee and dividend program, but it's sort of like a carbon tax. And, they've been working on this for a really long time, and it's slow progress. I mean, they are making progress for sure, but it doesn't, at that level, it doesn't happen quickly. You just have to be very, very patient. So great question. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the work that the CCL is trying to do on that issue.
So just following up on that really quickly, Sue, you made a very important point, I think, that if citizens aren't talking to our politicians and policymakers, a lobbyist is.
Yeah.
So I wonder, Peter, and maybe from that study that you cited, maybe that's an indication, that disconnect between public opinion and how politicians and policymakers acted. Maybe that actually is an indication of the great power of lobbyists, and we need to get in there ourselves if we want it to be different. Was that part of the story, or am I looking through rose-colored glasses?
No, that's really true. And sometimes the paid lobbyists are actually writing the legislation. You think about, especially in Congress, the bills are often thousands of pages long, and some of the lobbyists are actually submitting that language. So that's why citizens need to step up and submit their own language. It's that important. And the thing is these congressional delegations do come home, and it's really effective to try to meet them here in Maine, actually, because then they're sort of seeing things differently. They're at home, and you may be able to get your story told even better here in Maine. So yeah, it's really, really important. It's sort of unfortunate that, kind of where we are is that there's just so many paid lobbyists, and a lot of them are paid a lot of money to argue for what their client wants. So so it's really important for citizens to come forward and say, wait a second, this is what our experience is. That's the role of citizens, to talk about your actual experience.
Great. So
I hope I answered the question.
So we have a hand up, Katrina Matheson, and then we have a question in the chat as well. Katrina, go first.
Thank you. And thank you so much for this presentation. It was great. My question is, obviously, I agree with you. It's really important that individuals, do more, talk to more people, et cetera. I was curious what you think of the media and how they're covering the climate crisis. And do you think it's worth redirecting some of that energy towards the media so that individuals don't have to keep having the private conversations, that there might be a change in tone of how things are covered in the media?
Such a great question. In fact, in the book, there's a whole chapter called Working with the Media, because it's such an important part of advocacy work. And I do think that the real media, meaning journalists who actually research the issue and research the facts, they do some really good work. And it's really important to present information to them. In fact, when you're working on a campaign, such as the Pine Tree Amendment, one of the typical things to do is to go meet with the editorial boards of the newspapers or of television stations and say, here's what it is we're working on, here's the issue. So that could be really helpful strategy, is to work through the media to get the attention of decision makers. And same thing applies with writing letters to the editor or op-ed pieces. Very, very typical in campaigns that people would do regular, there'd be regular, different people would send in letters to the editor and that kind of thing to try to work through the media to change decision maker opinions. So yes. Now, the other thing, and I'm sure everybody here is aware of this, is that there's a lot of opinion out there that's really not journalism. It's just particularly on social media, but there's been a great confusion between facts and opinion going on. And people are sort of saying whatever they want without, any facts to back it up. In fact, there's a lot of things are just plain lies. I mean, we saw this in the campaign for the corridor that happened, before Election Day. Some of the things that were being put out there were absolutely false, basically. And they were being broadcast on television. And there's a really big difference between advertising and opinion and journalism. They're totally different things. And a lot of people seem to not really understand the difference between the two. But media is definitely a tool that can be used in your favor. And especially, local media, like local weekly papers and things like that, they need content. So you can often get something put into a local paper to help your cause, and especially if you can either write it up or you can actually contact a journalist. I've done this a number of times, contact a journalist and say, I think I have a story for you. Would you be interested in talking to me? And then they'll interview you and write it up for you. So, that's a really good strategy to use to get, your issue in front of people, including decision makers.
Great. Misty, do you want to ask your question or shall I? Okay, I'll read it for you. So Misty Maller asks about the Pine Tree Amendment. She says, I'm curious if Maine's Wabanaki tribal representatives have been actively involved in crafting or pushing forward this amendment. This would seem a natural fit and part of healing and reparation and rights for Maine's Native people. Have they been involved?
Yes, great question. And the answer is yes, they have been. In fact, we decided to not go forward until we had the support of the tribes. So very early on, we met with the tribes to see if they would support it, and they have. And one of the things that's really great about the Pine Tree Amendment is that if it passes, these would be environmental rights for all people. So basically, environmental injustices happen when some people are treated badly, right? But if we had this constitutional amendment, what it would mean is that, no group of people, no community, no neighborhood could be sacrificed environmentally. We've had these sacrifice zones like Cancer Alley, which I talked about earlier, is an example of one where we just sacrifice these communities so we could have plastics manufacturing plants. Well, if every person has a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment, then that's a tool for environmental justice. You can't say that this neighborhood, we're going to pollute the air there because, we need jobs and we need plastic materials, right? I mean, it's kind of a subtle way of creating an environmental justice tool. It's good. Of course, the other thing with the tribes is that they are they're sort of sovereign nations. And so I'm not sure legally exactly how the Constitution affects them legally, but certainly conceptually, they are behind it. And we have been openly in dialogue with them, and they are on board with it.
That's great to hear. And certainly the environmental justice movement that was kind of born and very active, and I think it began in North Carolina, very much used civil rights legislation to and create, collected the data to prove the disparity between the affluent white neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods where people of color lived, and demonstrated the differences. And that was one of the things that really has created a difference and a change.
Yep.
So do we have any more questions from the audience? I have a few more kind of in my back pocket that I can ask, but I do want to let people in the audience have a fair shot. Any hands or notes in the chat? Well, I will push forward with one. So I know you have a history in politics, and I know it's very important to work with everyone on an issue that's as important as climate change, that will impact all of us, no matter whether we believe in it or voted against or for whatever policy is on the table. But we are at the brink of urgency, where things need to happen. We're running out of time to build a great coalition and get everybody on board.
Yeah.
So where does urgency trump politics? And if half the world who's dragging their feet are just wrong, how important is it to bring them along versus forge ahead where people are in agreement, and where politicians are open to the letters to their mail slot and where they'll listen? Can you talk a little bit about how you see that part of climate action that's required, and the urgency of what we face, and how to move forward?
Yeah, this is the big worry that we all have, is, are we going to move fast enough?
Right.
Because, and the reports from the United Nations are saying that there's already a certain amount of climate damage that has already happened. So that's the big worry. But again, it kind of gets to critical mass where, I would say it's not worth trying to convince people that are never going to be convinced. It's more important to move forward with people who already get it. That's what I think. And to hold decision makers accountable, especially corporate decision makers. That's one of the things that I was thinking about this during the Glasgow summit, is that, yeah, okay, it's one thing for political leaders to all be there and all be talking about this, but much of, if not most of, the damage is being caused by corporate operations. And so how can we get particularly oil and gas industry to sort of tell the truth? It's really interesting, actually, what's going on with that, because there's been comparisons with big tobacco, that the tobacco industries for years, denied that there was any health issues with smoking, right? And of course, we all know now that that was lying. Same thing's kind of happening with oil and gas. They are actually saying, oh, yes, we're green and we support renewables, while they're actually increasing the amount of oil and gas they're extracting, and have sharply increased that over the past several years. And so they need to be exposed for what they're actually doing. And so that's really an important point, and that a lot of action needs to be focused there. Now, one of the really interesting things, I just wrote a blog post about this about a week ago, that there was a case against Shell Oil in The Hague, the Netherlands court. And the court found that Shell was responsible for climate change, not only from their own activities and operations, but also from products that were made out of their oil and gas, and also for emissions from people who burned their oil and gas in their cars, in their homes, whatever. So it was a groundbreaking landmark case. The first time a corporation had been held accountable for things that not only they were doing, but that were happening downstream of their own activities. And so I saw that, and that's why I blogged about it, because I saw that as a huge pivot point. And I think what we're going to see, and it's really interesting, because what we're seeing is this idea of environmental rights in a really big picture way. I mean, there's one thing to put it in the state constitution, but this court in the Netherlands said people's environmental rights are being harmed by Shell Oil Company globally. That's in a bigger arena. And they should be held accountable for it. And they were ordered to slash their emissions by 49% by, oh, I've forgotten, 2030, maybe, by a certain date. So I think what we're going to see actually is a lot of legal action against polluters. I think that's where we're headed. And we're also, I think, headed towards, a trend towards environmental rights of all kinds and everywhere, not just in little Maine Constitution, but I think it's coming. And I think that's going to really help speed things up. I think convincing politicians is going to be much harder, but there are other routes to go that may actually make it happen more quickly.
Yeah, the corporate role is an interesting one to untangle in all of this.
Yeah.
So Deirdre has one more question. She's curious about what your thinking is about how do we name this issue? Is it the climate crisis, climate change, or something else?
How we name it?
Yeah, how we talk about it and what's the power of what we call it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because it's been changing. At first it was
Global warming.
Global warming and greenhouse gases. And then actually what's happening is the language is getting stronger. And so now it's climate crisis, not climate change, but climate crisis. And I think that's the way it should go, is that we need to really call it what it is and not try to, like, for a while back when there was a lot more doubt and denial going on, we would kind of sugarcoat our words, and say, well, it's climate change and a greenhouse effect. Now we've got to say this is a climate crisis that has to be solved. So I think that's the right way to go, is to make it stronger language. And language is important, as this person asking the question knows. It is important. So yeah, it's a crisis now.
And kudos once again to the marvelous community of Belfast, Maine, which just had a climate change committee for many years that recently changed their name to the Climate Crisis Committee. So they're a step ahead of this conversation.
There we go.
And I think with that, maybe we're out of time, but thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sue, for writing your book, for using your COVID days so productively and providing this resource to all of us who are interested in changing the world that we live in and making it a better place. Thanks to all of you who joined us. And of course, thanks to the Belfast Free Library for pulling this all together. And to you, Brenda, I'll pass it over to you to close this out.
All right. And thank you, Sarah, for leading the questions. And of course, Sue, thank you very much for the presentation. I think people got a lot out of it. And the book is available at the library, at the Green Store, and at Left Bank Books. So it's a great book. I'm getting through it. And Sue, I think today, wasn't it coming out on audiobook today?
Actually, I forgot all about that. Yes, the audiobook is releasing today. So you can get it on all those audio, like Audible and all those places that you get audiobooks will have it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm an audiobook person, so.
Yep.
Me
Yeah.
too.
All right, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and thank you everybody
keep
for coming.
the conversations going. Keep the conversations going.
And make your observation if you've been seeing something change around you, or you have a personal Earth story. That's exactly the kind of story that we're looking for people to contribute to the ABCD collection. And you can find that through our website. We'll drop a link in the chat. And remember, this month, if you submit your story, what's the date again, Brenda?
December 21st.
By December 21st, you're in the running for your own copy of Sue Inch's book.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Good.
All right.
All right. So we'll drop a link in the chat to that. I'm just going to pull it up.
I already did.
You did. Okay. Already. So we'll see you on our website and see you next time.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.